Welcome back to the show, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, heroes and villains. I'm your host, Deshaun Fauntleroy. I know your time is precious, so we're going to get right into today's show. Crawling around on the edge of a roof that's 50 feet high, installing high voltage electrical equipment, and having to paint around this stuff, especially when it's windy. You screw up and you're dead, literally. You want to talk about pressure? You're in the right place today. I have a special guest coming on. And with this guest today, we're going to discuss performing under pressure, the difference between stress and pressure, the anatomy of choking, how pressure affects our thinking, and pressure traps. Today, I want to introduce Dr. Henry Weisinger, also known as Hank Weisinger. This is the guy that you really want to listen to regarding the science and how to perform under pressure. Dr. Weisinger, welcome to the show. Tell us what you've been up to lately.
Well, I have been up to actually having a pretty good time, doing some traveling, some writing, and spending time with my friends. I couldn't ask for a better life.
You know, I know you've been quite busy. I reached out to you a couple of months ago, and we were finally able to coordinate something today. I read your book. I had a chance to go through your e-course on how to perform under pressure. One of the things that I really like about your material is you actually go into the science of pressure. You know, I remember growing up, you know, coaches would say, be a leader. You have to be a leader so your team will be able to help you perform when you're under pressure. But nobody gave me any systems and strategies on how to deal with stress or how to deal with pressure. I wanted you to give us a general overview on performing under pressure and what that means to you.
Sure. And let me just say, we'll touch back on this point, that when the coach says you have to be a leader, inadvertently, he's actually increasing the amount of pressure that you will feel. One of the big differences, because I know that you have a lot of athletes that you work with and that listen to your show, and one of the things that I want to point out is I am not a sports psychologist. I am a clinical psychologist. And I did not study peak performance. I did not study how to be an elite performer. Instead, I studied the concept or the construct of pressure. And by studying pressure, rather than studying peak performance, it actually created a lot of revelations that I think can be very helpful. And to cut to the chase, if I would have to personify pressure, I would say that it is a villain in your life. There is nothing good about pressure. Athletes who say, I thrive under pressure, actually that is not true. There are studies conducted all over the world that consistently show that pressure downgrades our mental and our behavioral performance. It downgrades your cognitive skills, your judgment, your decision making, your memory, your comprehension, your psychomotor coordination. So there is nothing good about pressure. And what I want people quickly to realize, because this is one of the things that I've discovered, I call it one of the myths of pressure. Nobody rises to the occasion. This is what I thought. I'm a big sports fan. So when I was growing up and I was a big Yankee fan, you know, I was always looking at my clutch players, the guy who came through when the game is on the line. And what I found out is nobody does that, is that the edge is not rising to the occasion. The edge is not doing worse. Everybody makes a big deal about how great, like in the last Super Bowl, Tom Brady was. He just played his typical performance. He didn't rise to the occasion. Tom Brady is the best quarterback. So given the fact that if he plays his best, the chances are he's going to win. That's what happens with the best players. Derek Jeter, another big icon of mine, did not rise to the occasion. His average in the postseason was .311. his average in the regular season was 310. He just didn't choke. So that's a big difference. The C student, for example, is never getting 1600 on their SATs unless they cheat. But many times the A student will fold. So one of the things that I want people to realize is that in those pressure moments, you don't have to rise to the occasion. You don't have to do something special. A basketball player who can only have a jump off the ground 30 inches during the playoffs is not going to start jumping 40 inches. So what people have to realize is that the key is to do your best, but your best might not be good enough. A track star can run a great 100-yard dash, but the bottom line is the guy next to him was faster. That doesn't mean that he choked. A student can have a tremendous resume, but they still get rejected from Harvard. It doesn't mean that they blew anything. Athletes, I have found, never feel bad when they play their best and lose. They only feel bad or disappointed when they play below their capability. So I think that is a very important point. And I think that once you realize that you don't have to rise to the occasion, you just have to do, especially in sports, what you have been doing, that takes a lot of pressure off.
You know, those are some brilliant points, Dr. Weisinger. I remember growing up playing middle school sports, high school sports, later some indoor football and some semi-pro football. And I know for sure those games that I wasn't prepared, level of play completely down. I know there were some games where I let the pressure get to me and I did the so-called choking thing. What I really appreciate about your material and especially in your book is some of the epiphanies that came out of your research, such as pressure adversely impacts our cognitive process. Those are one of the that was one of the takeaway points that I got. You further, brought up how pressure downgrades our behavioral skills. And sometimes, or in pressure moments, most people perform below their capability. And it sounds like that was what you were discussing in reference to the Derek Jeter example.
Exactly. He just did not choke. He was just consistent. And what I have found is what great athletes, they do two things. One is that they are very consistent. That's where their greatness is, in their consistency. And two, they always look to do their best. I watched hundreds of Yankee games, and I will tell you, the one great thing about Jeter, if he hit a ground ball back to the pitcher, he would still sprint to first base. There are some athletes, and this is very big in basketball, that after they have clinched a spot in the playoffs, they're not going to kill themselves. They're just going to go through the motions. Why should they burn up all their energy? So then all of a sudden in the playoffs, they're playing great, and the announcer will say, oh, they're rising to the occasion. No, they're not rising to the occasion. They're just playing to their potential. The reality is that they played below their potential after their playoff spot was clinched. A lady is a financial advisor, and this is another thing. That competition, for example, does not bring out the best in people. This is another myth. Competition brings out the worst in you, not the best of you. Carl Lewis, probably the most famous Olympic athlete of all time, said that in a track meet, he never worried about the guy running next to him. He can't control how fast the other guys run. All he could do was simply focus on his best. Serena Williams, many people think, if you asked her, what is your goal when you play a tennis match? And this is where many athletes, again, go off on the wrong road. They say that their goal is to win. Serena Williams' goal is never to win. It is always to play her best. And if she plays her best, well, who's going to beat her? The only way a great athlete loses is if they choke because they're better than the other person. So when the Patriots play a team like the Jets, the only way the Jets can win is if the Patriots play below their ability. Because all things being equal, talent always wins.
Ladies and gentlemen, parents, coaches, student athletes, if you're listening to this, you have to stay consistent. You have to stay consistent with your studies. You have to stay consistent with your practice, your mental conditioning, your training, your film study.
And Deshaun, you make a good point, because earlier you said you can remember the times when you were playing in sports and you weren't prepared and then you played poorly. That's one of the big points, that practice is the best way to overcome feelings of pressure, because it gives you confidence. Confidence is the antithesis of pressure. You're not feeling, Tommy Lasorda, the great Dodger manager, said, when you're thinking about pressure, you're thinking about losing. And
right.
And what I want people to realize is that great athletes, the word pressure is not even in their vocabulary. They don't even think of it as pressure. They think of it as fun. They think of it as a opportunity. They think of it as a challenge. So the word pressure isn't even in their vocabulary. And we should define pressure for people who are listening.
Yeah, I was just getting to that, Dr. Weisinger. I'm glad you brought that up. You were reading my mind. I wanted you to discuss stress and pressure, or pressure and stress. You can start with either one, but you're right on point with where we're going.
Yeah, because a lot of people, pressure and stress are not the same. And one of the findings that I had as I'm reading academic studies is that most people confuse the two. Even researchers, they'll start a paragraph using the word stress. They'll end the same paragraph using the word pressure to refer to the same thing. And they are vastly different. And I want to differentiate for people. First of all, in every pressure situation, there is stress. But in every stressful situation, there is not pressure. I want people to think of stress as simply when you have a lot of demands made upon you and you don't think you have enough resources to respond. So if you have too many financial bills and not enough cash, you will experience financial stress.
Right.
Right. If you have 20 things to do on a Saturday, you have to get a haircut, pick up your friends, clean your house, go shopping. That's a lot of demands. Now, there's different ways of how you can deal with those demands. You can blow some of them off. You can delegate. You can take a nap to re-energize. On the other hand, if you're trying to land a plane on the Hudson River, taking a nap is not going to help. Now, you still have to be relaxed, but you still have to perform the task. So pressure, people listening experience pressure when they're in a situation that is important to them. They have something on the line, and the outcome is based on their performance. So if I'm up in the bottom of the ninth, and it's the World Series, that becomes a pressure situation because the outcome is dependent on my performance. If I knew I was getting a hit, then there's no pressure. Then there's certainty. This is why anxiety is always in a pressure moment, because anxiety is uncertainty. If I'm taking a test and I've already locked an A, there's no pressure in the final test. I could fail it. I still get an A. If you're watching a football game and the score is a 40-point differential and there's 2 seconds left, you can turn off the TV. If it's a tie score and the outcome is still uncertain, we're all on the edge of our seats. So stress sometimes can be helpful. Pressure is never helpful. I mean, let me ask you a question. Who invented pressure?
That's a real good question.
Yeah. Who invented, it's a do or die situation. That's not an ESPN analyst didn't come up with that term that we hear in every sporting event. That pressure has an evolutionary function.
Right.
And basically what that is to get rid of you. It's a selection mechanism. Deshaun, what happens to students in a competitive school if they can't handle the competition?
They don't make it.
That's right. What happens to a financial advisor if they're starting out and they can't handle the pressure.
He's
gone.
fired.
That's
he or
right.
she is fired or gone.
That's right. So for your ancestors, I mean, what do you think the first pressure moment was for man? What do you think the first competition was?
Well, you know what's interesting about where you're going, and not to interrupt, Dr. Weisinger, I know we have Whole Foods, we have all these different vegan and organic stores, especially out here in Portland, Oregon. I know y'all probably have some good places out there on the East Coast, but what if we just had to go hunt for our food today, or you couldn't eat for the rest of the month? You had to hunt.
Well, none of my friends would survive. That is, I mean, I've actually started out presentations like that where I make that statement and I look at the group and I say, the truth is 90% of you could not do it. You are gone. And I always like to think, the first competitive experience for man is we have a small piece of meat and there's not enough for two of us. Now, who's going to get that meat? What do you think the competition's going to be? Do you think it's going to be who can run the fastest? Who can throw the furthest? Who can climb the highest tree? The bottom line is going to be hand-to-hand combat. Do or die. That's where that expression came from, because for your ancestors, if they didn't perform, you would die. Now, it might seem like that. How many high school athletes have you worked with if they lose a race? They say, oh, my life is over. It feels like that, but in reality, the next day they're running another race. So the difference between, as a takeout, that I want people to realize is anytime you think you're feeling pressure, ask yourself, am I feeling overwhelmed or do I have to perform a task? And if you're feeling overwhelmed, most likely you're in a stressful situation. Step back, take a deep breath, delegate, prioritize, make yourself laugh. You have a lot of ways of reducing stress. If you feel as though you have to perform a task, most likely you are in a pressure moment, and then your best strategy is focus on the task. And that's a big difference, because if you confuse the two, every stressful demand becomes a do or die situation. And you are literally on high alert 24/7.
One thing I realized, man, throughout the winter, I've driven to Seattle with family and friends and by myself, on a number of occasions, but I help coach a 7-on-7 football team. And just driving from Portland to Seattle, you're talking about a 2-hour, maybe 2.5-hour trip. It is different. That drive is different when you have 3 or 4 athletes riding with you, because you have other lives at stake and you have to consider their parents. And you're right. I would just literally focus on the road, keep the music down low, just enough where they could hear it. But I remember some of those trips, I could feel the pressure because I was responsible for other kids that I was taking up, to compete. So I think that's interesting that you mentioned that.
And you're making another good point, because another element that creates pressure is that responsibility. The more responsible you feel for the results, the more pressure you experience. That's why when you don't care about something, there's no pressure, because you don't care. I will tell you a story that when my son was in 3rd grade and was in Little League, and he was up at bat, and it was one of those situations where literally the game was on the line. And my son always liked to play on team sports, with his friends. It wasn't like he was, the best athlete. He just had a good time. So he comes up, and it's like the last inning, and there's runners on base, and I see the coach pull him aside and whisper something to him. So then he gets back at bat, and all of a sudden, he gets a hit. He gets so excited, he forgot to run. Everybody had to yell, run, run. It was like such a shock, that he hit the ball. So he gets a hit, and everybody's congratulating him and so on. So afterwards, I said, Danny, what did the coach tell you? I'm curious. And he says, the coach said, Danny, it's all up to you. We're all relying on you. That was the worst thing the coach could have said. That actually increases the amount of pressure. That's analogous to a parent saying, I know you're going to make us proud. We'll be in the third row. That's the worst thing you could say. I mean, I would always tell parents, how would you like it if your kid came home and said, Dad, you got to get a new car. All the other fathers have Mercedes. You have a lousy Accord. Make me proud of you. Or the daughter comes home and says, Mom, you've got to go to the gym. You gained a lot of weight. Make me proud of you. Get in shape. But
Right.
we do that with our kids all the time.
Right, and especially with our athletes too, because you said, I'm sure you've heard this before. This is the biggest game of your life.
Exactly. Joe Flacco said right before the Super Bowl, how do you deal with the pressure? And his response was what the media hates to hear. It's just another game. Because the media will say, how could you say it's just another game? It's the Super Bowl, and so on. But that attitude is what allowed him to win the Super Bowl. Why should he do anything different? If you're a successful athlete, if you're a great golfer, why would you change how you play when you're in the Masters or the Open? Because when you do try to change how you play, that's when your performance starts to go down. That's when you would use the term pressing. How many times have you heard an announcer say, he's thinking too much? I remember watching a match that Serena lost, and Chris Everett said, she's not playing, she's thinking too much, which is the same statement that the boss's wife, Springsteen's wife, said in a concert, when she said, when you're on stage, you're not thinking, you're just playing. And that's what a lot of athletes forget to do. The coach would use the cliche of you have to trust yourself. And that's exactly what needs to happen. Why is a golfer thinking about his stroke that he's done 10,000 times? That should be, quote, automatic.
Automatic. So would you say, Dr. Weisinger, that when we start thinking, the thinking, especially if you're already a player at a high level, somebody like, a Tiger Woods or Michael Jordan, you never really hear this about those guys, like choking or the anatomy of choking is when we start thinking, is that a part of that?
It depends on the task. That's a great question. For example, if you're taking a math test, I want you to think, even though you've done math problems a million times. If you are serving a tennis ball, I don't want you to think. These are different tasks.
Yes.
And they require different approaches. A good example, Deshaun, is, do you remember when you first were learning how to drive?
Yes, I do.
How would you describe when you got into the car? Walk me through what you would do when you were first starting.
Oh, it was very mechanical. You're going to get in, put the keys in the car, and you're going to look in the rear view, both the rear view mirror, the outdoor mirror, the ones inside. Start it up. You go through all these mechanical tasks, like literally from maybe 10 steps, and you're thinking about each one.
Exactly. So when you are learning that, just like when you're learning, a musician is learning a new song, you're using what is called your working memory. You're storing information because you're learning. Now, let me ask you, when you get into your car later today, are you going to think, I got to put the keys in the car, check my mirrors, and so on? Or are you just going to do it?
No, it's so automatic. You could go from A to B and forget that you passed certain landmarks. I'm sure you've done that before.
Exactly. Now, if you want to scratch your car when you're pulling out of the garage, start to think of all the little things that you have to do. And you will become so overly cautious, you will start to make a mistake because you are interrupting what is already an automatic process. It's interesting. It's like it's like holding a cup of coffee and walking across the wall. If you're holding it and walking very slow and trying not to spill it, it becomes easier to spill it rather than just walking as you normally do.
So it sounds like when we talk about how pressure chokes us, you have at the center of human performance is like physical arousal, thoughts, and behavior. And those things, if one is out of whack, they can affect the other in terms of your performance.
That's right. Your thoughts, your arousal, think of it as a triangle. Your thoughts, your arousal, and your behavior are all at different corners, and they all influence each other. And what happens in a pressure situation, those components become disruptive, as in when you get butterflies in your stomach, or when you feel a sense of your muscles being tight. And then that starts to interfere on your performance. But an important point about choking, illustrated by my friend. I'm not a golfer, but when I am visiting my friend in California, he goes to play golf, I go along for the ride. So I laugh to myself when he has a 3-foot putt and he misses it. And then he'll say, "Oh, I choked." I have to explain to him, he's not choking. He's not good enough to make 3-foot putts consistently. When I play basketball and I miss a foul shot, I'm not choking. Now, if LeBron misses it, that's different because he can make 80 or 90% of his foul shots. I can't do that. So choking only applies if you can do the behavior in practice. If you can't do it in practice, why would you think you could do it in the moment of truth? So a lot of times we use the word choking when what we really mean is we're just not good enough. It's a choke if Phil Mickelson misses a 3-foot putt because he can do that 100 times in a row. And also, it's only a choke if you care. If I'm playing a friend in a sport and I really don't care about winning or losing, I'm just having a good time, that's not a choke. It's not a choke if a football team blows a lead, if they're already in the playoffs. They don't care. It's not a choke if a student gets a 70 on a chemistry test, but he already got an A. He just didn't study for the test. He doesn't care. And that's something a lot of people do not want to acknowledge because it's very hard to accurately assess your own abilities. And yet that is a requirement if you're ever going to build the level of competence.
You know what? That's interesting, Dr. Weisinger, because I worked with an athlete for about 3 years from middle school on into high school. And he was a basketball athlete and a football athlete. Wasn't the best basketball athlete, wasn't the best football athlete, but he played receiver, would drop a lot of balls, and complain about not getting playing time to get better. But at the end of the day, he didn't catch balls in practice. So I would explain to him, the coach isn't going to throw you 5 balls to give you an opportunity to catch one. If you get 1 ball a game, you have to catch that ball because that's going to buy you, another pass being thrown to you. But he never seemed to understand that. So at the end of the day, he never put in the work outside of practice to gain those skills. So I used to think that he would just choke on game day, but at the end of the day, he never had the skills based on what we're talking about now.
Right. And, it's also interesting in terms of sports that I've learned as I'm doing some work with the women's golf team at Yale. It's very interesting is that the higher status athletes on a team are more likely to choke than the lower status athletes. In other words, perform below their capability. And the reason is because the expectation is higher of the athlete. This is, I think, one of the things that happened with A-Rod. Every time he came up, as a Yankee fan, everybody's expecting, you're getting $25 million a year, you got to produce. That somebody who's only getting $3 million a year, there's no pressure on them because there's no expectation. So the thing that I would want coaches to remember is don't make somebody on the team the guy, the alpha athlete, because that actually increases more pressure on them because every time they have to perform, they're thinking of all that responsibility, and it's always on them. So that becomes an important point for coaches to to remember.
I would say even parents, because sometimes, I've had a lot of parents come to my gym, watch the training, have them interact with their kids or try to prompt the kids on while we're training. I had to remove one guy, and ask him to sit out in the lobby because he would just talk too much during the training. And James, if you're listening to this, I'm talking to you. This guy's a good friend of mine, but I would feel, he would put his son in stressful or pressurized conditions in training when he didn't have to, because we were working on Olympic lifting, which can be quite technical when you're at the beginning and it makes you think. So we had to break down things in parts, as you know, from a procedural standpoint, So parents, if you're listening, you have to remember, and you've heard this before, words carry power. They also carry a certain type of energy that can affect the person that you're talking to. And it's like channeling right where we're going with this conversation, Dr. Weisinger. Go ahead.
That is a great point. And it's the idea of the words with energy, because too many people ignore that. For example, again, I listen to ESPN and so on, and they're talking about the Jets, and I call up and I say, look, if you want to motivate the Jets, then you, instead of having Rex Ryan talk at halftime, you show them the speech that Pacino gave in any given Sunday. And all of a sudden, everybody will become enthused. It's very important to use and modulate your voice when you're trying to, quote, psych somebody up, because sound carries emotion. Remember the great movie Hoosiers with Gene Hackman?
Yes, true story.
Yes, and there was a scene where before his team takes the court, he has them start to clap. And they're clapping faster and faster. And he said, come on, faster, faster. And they clap so fast, they're so aroused. He says, all right, let's go to the court. And they're enthusiastic. How many times am I watching now an NCAA basketball game, and after a timeout, the coach starts to clap? That's become standard. These become ways of creating positive arousal in your body. Yes. And that's very, very important, because it's contagious. If you are an enthusiastic coach, the chances are that you're going to make your athletes enthusiastic. I remember I looked at the Yankees sitting in the dugout, and they looked like they were falling asleep. And that becomes a contagious emotion too. So it's very important to, as the coach, as the parent, as the teacher, to increase your awareness to how the words coming out of your mouth are sounding. Do they sound enthusiastic? That is very, very important.
Yes, Dr. Weisinger, I wanted to ask you, man, we're starting to get into the fourth quarter here. How does pressure affect our thinking?
In a couple of ways. One is that it can make your thinking very rigid. Now, that's a negative if you're taking a test, especially if it's an essay test, because you've lost your mental flexibility. However, if I am a weightlifter, if I am a track athlete, that rigidity can work to my advantage, because it narrows my focus, and I won't be distracted by things that are outside of that focus. For the quarterback, becoming rigid in your thinking is a disaster, because the quarterback needs to process all the information that is happening in the moment.
Right.
So one way is that it makes your thinking more rigid, which, depending on the task, can work for you or against you. If I'm a doctor and I'm doing an operation, I want that rigid thinking, because it's going to zero my attention on my task. Another way that it affects our thinking is what it creates, what I call pressure distortions. And what a pressure distortion is a style of thinking that many times becomes habitual, that intensifies the feelings of pressure, such as magnification. Magnification means that you are exaggerating the importance of a situation. This is why it's bad for a coach to say, this is the most important game of the year. That's the stupidest thing a coach can say, because the more important you make something, the more pressure you experience. I already told you, Flacco said, it's just another game. I got my PhD from Kansas, so I am a diehard Jayhawk basketball fan. And when I am watching Kansas last year after they win their game in the Sweet 16, and then I hear Bill Self say to the announcer, well, now we go against Oregon, and it's the biggest game of the year, I knew Kansas was going to lose.
If you could have spoke to him at that point, what would you have said to him?
I would have said, Bill, just tell them just to play their usual. If they play their usual, they are a better team than Oregon, then we have nothing to worry about. Don't intensify the pressure by telling them this is the most important game of their life, and 30,000 Jayhawk fans will be watching them, and they're playing in home fans. They don't want to disappoint anybody. That is not what you want to say. So one of the things, I mean, it's counterintuitive for a parent to say, don't worry about the SATs, it's no big deal, but that's exactly what you want to tell them. Why should they get psyched out about it? It's just another test. And the other thing is that how pressure affects our thinking is it makes us think in terms of singularity. I call it chance of a lifetime. I'm never going to get a chance like this again. I'm never going to get to be in a sporting event again. And when you think like that, it quadruples the stakes because you've made it a do or die situation. The coach wants to let his team know there's always another game. The parent wants their kids to know there's always another test. I was talking to a bunch of financial executives one time. There must have been about 500 of them, financial advisors. And one young guy gets up and he says, okay, how do you handle the pressure situation when you're calling a girl that you really like? I said, that's a lot of pressure for me. And before I could respond, another guy jumps up, a few years older, and he says, just remember, there's 1,000 other girls waiting for the same phone call. Everybody laughed,
right?
But everybody knew it was true. And when you think like that, it reduces pressure. When I first started teaching at UCLA, it's like every presentation I would say, this is the most important presentation of my life. No wonder I was feeling nervous. That's what I'm saying to myself. It took me a while to realize that even if I gave a terrible presentation, by the time I got home, there'd be 10 other messages on my machine asking me to speak at their particular conference. So when you remember that you're going to get another opportunity, it allows you to relax, and then you can start to play your best.
You know,
and that point about choking, just so people have something, I want them to remember that one way or another, when we get distracted, sometimes we get distracted by our self-conscious thoughts. We start to think, what is the coach thinking? What are my parents thinking? What are my teammates thinking? What is Nike thinking? What's going to happen to my contract if I blow this?
Right.
Well, if you're thinking that, you're going to blow it. And also, many athletes, they focus on winning. And if you focus on winning, then you're focusing on the outcome. You don't focus on winning. You focus on doing your best. During the Olympics, they had a guy on interviewing him, and he was saying, well, it's been a good year, but if I don't win the gold, the year's been a waste. I knew he was going to choke because he's thinking about the gold medal rather than on his task. So what happens? He comes down the ski slope, and all of a sudden he falls. To me, that was predictable.
You know,
So I want people to stay in the moment. Don't think about winning or losing. You have no control over that. The only control you have is on doing your best.
Now, Dr. Weisinger, let me slow you down for a little bit, because it sounds like some of these behaviors and some of this thinking, you know, it goes back to a concept that you have in your book, pressure traps.
Yes, a pressure trap what I found is that there were conventional ways of how we try to motivate people, and ironically, many of the ways that we try to motivate people actually put more pressure on them, and they cause people to do things that they normally might not do. For example, I say to you, listen, you have your big math test tomorrow, and if you do well on your math test, I'm going to get you a new iPhone. Now I walk out of the room. Now you're the kid, and you really want that iPhone. So you know what? You're going to give yourself some insurance, so you'll make a little crib sheet, because you really want that incentive. So ironically, we use incentives to motivate people. But that becomes a trap, because it actually increases the pressure, because the person wants that incentive so much that they're willing to do anything for it. This is what happened. I've done a lot of work in the financial industry. This is what happens with financial companies, that the person's going to get a bonus, and that bonus is going to transfer into millions of dollars. So what if I get some inside information, or I bend the laws or ethics a little bit? I mean, let me ask you, why do smart kids cheat? If they're so smart, why do they cheat on a test? Every major school or top school has had cheating scandals, including Harvard. Bedford-Stuyvesant, which is the most competitive school in New York, had the biggest cheating scandal ever in New York City. So if the kids are so smart, why do they have to do that? And the answer, of course, is, as Flip Wilson would have said, the pressure made them do it. How many times have you heard executives say they did illegal things because of the pressure? So that's what a pressure trap is. It's like being supportive. Can you imagine a sporting event, Deshaun, where the referee comes up and he says, "Well, we're going to have to suspend this match, not because of the weather or it's getting dark, but it's too much pressure on the players, so we have to play it." But that's actually what happened in one of the, I think it was one of the, what's that golf match where the United States plays other countries? The Ryder Cup, I believe, where Tiger Woods was up against Ernie Els, and they had 4 playoff holes, and they called it off because they said no golfer should be under this much pressure. And his team was being totally supportive. That's what intensified the pressure. The feelings, as you pointed out, of responsibility.
You know, I wanted to break what you're saying down to a more simpler level, Dr. Weisinger. I have a kid that I've worked with this athlete for the last couple of years. He's now a sophomore in high school. He transferred from a public school to one of the top-ranked private schools in the state. I think they're probably ranked number 3 or 4 in the state right now, but they play their rival, who is probably ranked number 2 in the state right now. And they're going into their second game of the season, and the head coach tells him that he's starting, where he plays running back and receiver. So one of the things I said to him when I talked to him and his dad earlier in the week was that just take the 4 and 5 yard gains. Don't worry about the big runs. Take what the defense gives you. You know, I know I'm trying to ease his anxiety and the pressure, right? What would you say to a kid in this situation who is an exceptional student athlete?
Again, my standard message to those students, whether they're an exceptional athlete or whether they're just average, what is the best they can do? They can only do their best. There's no other message. Just do your best. Now, if I have trained the person, he's going to know when I say, or she's going to know when I say do your best, they're already going to have a bunch of tools that is going to allow them to do their best. I actually feel I've discovered the mindset of what it takes to reduce pressure in a competitive event. And I'll share some of those points quickly. One is to befriend the moment. So I'm telling a person, that athlete, have fun. This is a challenge. Have a good time. This is exactly what coaches, they always, in basketball, they always say, all right, go out and let's have some fun. Derek Jeter says that some people call it pressure. He said, of course there's pressure, but you can't do well if you're not enjoying yourself. So he just says, that it's going to be fun. When he's up in the ninth inning and it's the World Series, he's thinking, this is really fun. This is really exciting. So you want to befriend the moment. The biggest difference between people who do well under pressure, meaning close to their capabilities, and people who choke is, do they perceive the situation as an opportunity or as a threat? If you perceive the SATs as threatening, you're going to do poorly. If you perceive the SATs as a chance to show your stuff and an opportunity to get you into the school that you want to go to, you will do close to your best. Two is, I would teach people, anticipate all the things that could go wrong. Peyton Manning and Tom Brady had a common denominator. They anticipated everything the defense could throw at them. Therefore, when it happens, it's no big deal. Practicing, by the way, in novel situations is really smart. Going to the golf course and hitting off the driving range 200 balls is a total waste of time. What is much better is to practice on a golf course shots that you're never going to have to do, because that develops what psychologists call your fluid intelligence. Fluid intelligence means that you can adapt to novel situations so you don't lose your composure. How many times have we seen a sporting event where something happens to the athlete, they get a bad break, a bad call, and then all of a sudden they've lost their composure? I want athletes to anticipate they're going to get a bad call, and then they can figure out how they will overcome it. 3, always think in multiple opportunities. That way you never make it a do or die situation. 4, always focus on, no matter whether it's a test or a basketball game, focus, as I've said several times, doing your best. 5, flashback on successes. So the baseball player who goes up and bases loaded, I guarantee that in a microsecond, he is thinking of all the other times he's been in a similar situation and has been successful. Steve Nash said that when he makes foul shots, he's thinking he's done this 10,000 times. Why would this time be any different? So those are some mental framework that I would want people to be armed with in terms of their thinking when they go into that pressure moment.
Right. Ladies and gentlemen, you're listening to Dr. Hank Weisinger. What I need you to do is visit Sports Mastery on iTunes. Like, rate, and review this. I'm telling you, this is a 5-star show. It's taken us 2 months to set this date so that we can interview. I really feel like Dr. Weisinger is delivering some valuable information. He has a great book out there that you can find on Amazon or his website, Performing Under Pressure. Dr. Weisinger, what I'm really excited about is your course. I had a chance to go through your course. I know you have one for adults and one for students. Tell my audience about that and where that can be found. And I want you to know I'm going to link this into the show notes also, where we'll have a link from the sportsmastery.com website.
Yes, first of all, my website is Hank Weisinger, and I'll spell it, WEISINGER.PhD.com. And if you go to that website, under courses, you'll see the online Performing Under Pressure class, which I am very excited about. It has a lot of fun videos, from different movie clips to videos that are instructional, great downloads. The pressure solutions, of which there are 22 of them, when you print them out, they come out as cards. So that means they're mobile. So you can put them on your desk, your night table, your office desk, on your refrigerator. It's a way of giving yourself a support structure. And I think it's a excellent class. I think it's a lot of fun. And I want people to know that they have lifetime access to it, because I'm always updating it. And also, Deshaun, I will send you a coupon code so that anybody who uses that coupon, which you can put on your link, will get a 10% discount on the course. And it's not expensive to begin with, so it's pretty inexpensive.
I would agree. It is definitely inexpensive for what you're asking for. You know, I've bought other courses in the past and probably paid 2 to 3 times that amount, and I can say for sure that it's worth it. You know, I would say once a year, I read 2 to 3 different books that helps change or enhance my business or the services that I provide. And your book is definitely one of those when we're discussing how to perform under pressure. You offer a tremendous amount of systems and strategies to use to increase performance, whether you're a student, whether you're an athlete in a corporate world, an executive, it is all in there. And I really appreciate meeting you, man.
Right, me too. And if I could make one more point, I want people to know, especially with athletes, they're mostly concerned with performing in the moment. And to tackle that, as I said, I discovered evidence-based 22 pressure solutions. So if you have an event coming up and you start to feel the pressure 1 minute before, you can learn how can you reduce the pressure 30 seconds before you need to perform. These are what I call short-term solutions. But the long-term solutions for doing your best every day is to be able to build what I like to call your coat of armor: confidence, optimism, tenacity, and enthusiasm. And if people need to learn how to instill those attributes in themselves, because if you do, then you do your best every day. And some of those everyday situations will be those, quote, pressure moments. That's why I'm saying it's not a big deal when we think an athlete, they're not coming through in the clutch. They are just doing what they do every single day. So the long-term strategies that a coach wants to instill in his or her team, that a parent wants to instill in their kids, is confidence, optimism, tenacity, and enthusiasm. And one more tip for coaches: too many athletes have their self-esteem attached to how they perform. Just like students attached to what they get on the SATs. And if those performances are subpar, the athlete, the student, the financial advisor, they start to feel badly about themselves. So it's very important to make, whether it's a student athlete, whether it's your kids, it's very important to give them the message that regardless of how they do, they are still a worthwhile and great person. And that message protects their self-esteem, and it helps them build a sense of resiliency to make it easier for them to turn setbacks into comebacks.